One, we thank the Contra Costa Jewish Day School. We are in the Contra Costa Jewish Day School. It is not the only time we're in the day school. We give our classes here. We have events here, and the Contra Costa Jewish Day School really has become a center for Jewish learning, and we thank them for making this wonderful venue available for us. I'd also like to thank Reb Reuven Schwedel, the Schwedel family, for sponsoring tonight's event in loving memory of Lori, Rebbes Army. Beautiful event, a beautiful way to honor Lori. Lori is definitely with us here tonight. Yesher Koyach. So it was about a year and a half ago when Chaya and I traveled to Chicago, and we went to something called the National Jewish Retreat. And we were together with actually Reuven and with Eve and with a couple of others. And I believe Eve got into a conversation with Rabbi Eliezrie. And after the conversation, Eve told me, Rabbi Berkowitz, we have to get Rabbi Eliezrie to come to Contra Costa. And then another year went by. And this time, Eve came again, and Joanne and Arnold were there. And this time all together, they said, we have to get Rabbi Eliezrie to come to Contra Costa. I have known Rabbi Eliezrie for a couple of years now. When I was a yeshiva student in Los Angeles, we used to take drives down from LA to Yorba Linda. Rabbi Eliezrie's son Yosef was in the hospital at the time, and the younger students were classmates of his, and we used to take turns to bring the classmates to visit Yosef, and we had some very interesting conversations. And so, just about this summer, Rabbi Eliezrie released his book, The Secret of Chabad, and so we felt that this would be a beautiful way to bring him down as an author. And then on Sukkot, we had the honor of personally meeting Sue in our sukkah, and the idea was born that why not have the author of the Rebbes Army, who is now the editor of the J Weekly, interview the author of The Secret of Chabad.
Maybe we'll figure something out.
So it's an honor to have both of you, Sue and Rabbi Eliezrie, here tonight with us. And I'm just going to give the short, brief bio and then hand over the floor. So, Rabbi Dovid Eliezrie is a veteran Chabad Shliach. You're going to hear the word Shliach many times, or Shluchim. Shliach is a Chabad rabbi. And Rebbitzin. Together they make a team of a Shliach and a Shlucha, or in plural, Shluchim. In Yorba Linda, California. He was previously the Jewish chaplain at the University of Miami. He's president of the Rabbinical Council of Orange County. He's a member of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Board of the Jewish Federation of Orange County, and International Conference of Shluchim. Rabbi Eliezrie studied in Yeshiva's Tomchei Temimim, that's the Chabad Yeshiva in Kfar Chabad, Israel. It's like this little shtetl in Israel. And Brooklyn, that's like this little shtetl in America. He's a noted writer and lecturer, married and the proud father of 6 children and an ever-growing number of grandchildren. And interviewing Rabbi Eliezrie is Sue Fishkoff. Sue is the editor of the J Weekly, the Jewish News Weekly of Northern California, which has served the Bay Area community since 1895. Could you believe it? She has worked in the Jewish media for 30 years, including serving as a staff writer for the Jerusalem Post in Israel and New York, and working as a national correspondent for the JTA.org, which is the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. She is the author of 2 books on Jewish topics, Kosher Nation, Why More and More of America's Food Answers to a Higher Authority, and the book that brings her here tonight, The Rebbes Army, Inside the World of Chabad Lubavitch. She lives in Oakland, and yet is a Giants fan. So, the Chabad,
Hello. Okay. I used to call up Sue. She used to interview me. I used to spin her stories. That was a long time ago.
Rabbi Berkowitz, what's our time frame tonight? How many hours do we have? sort of
Like developer.
an hour, or
Hour to an hour and a half, I think.
including questions. Fine.
The guy in the third row begins to fall asleep, then we're in trouble.
So thank you all for coming tonight. And as the interviewer, I get to start off the conversation. And I was really excited to come here tonight, not just because I have had professional interactions with Rabbi Eliezrie over the years, and back when I was working on my book, he helped me understand some of the things that were going on in Chabad. But I was particularly interested in this conversation because we come at the topic from radically different perspectives. Rabbi Eliezrie is the shliach of the Rebbe. He is an insider. He's a Chabadnik. And I'm an outsider. I'm a journalist. I'm a member of a conservative congregation in Berkeley, right? So our interests were different, but it's interesting that much of what we wrote about was the same. So I want to tell you very quickly why I wrote my book, and then I want to find out why Rabbi Eliezrie wrote his book. So for me, I started work 15 years ago on this book, and I was interested as a member of a liberal Jewish denomination. I was fascinated with why so many non-Orthodox Jews in America were fascinated with Chabad, right? Why are so many Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist and unaffiliated Jews sending their kids to Chabad summer camps and coming to Chabad for holiday celebrations and coming to Jewish Learning Institute courses? What is Chabad giving American Jewry that we are not getting from our birth denominations, and what can the rest of the Jewish world learn from that? I was very interested not in making everybody a Lubavitcher, but in what lessons can be learned from what we learned from Chabad. What Rabbi Eliezrie and I shared in our books is a fascination with what motivates the Chabad Shluchim. Who are these young couples, and older couples, but they're young when they start, who leave their homes and their home communities and start Chabad centers or work in Chabad centers all over the world, working with Jews radically different from themselves without changing who they are, right? So I don't want to get too much into that right now because we're going to talk about what the secret of Chabad is, and as I suggested before, we might figure some of it out. But that's why I wrote my book. I wanted to know what made them so successful and why they were so appealing to secular Jewish society. So Rabbi Eliezrie, why did you write?
First, the strength and the weakness, my strength and weakness is that I'm an insider looking out, and I think Sue's strength and her weakness is that she's an outsider looking in. So we really brought to the same subject a very different kind of view. And I think she did a magnificent job in her book, and for the record, I bought 200 copies. So I'm her biggest supporter.
I just have one of his, but it hasn't been out as long.
That's right. I'm hoping she's going to buy 200 copies. I made her a bulk order. But what happened was, I felt that Sue's book broke tremendous ground. But when I started working on that book, I think it was just before yours came out. I started over 10 years ago. And as Dover mentioned, I had a little bit of an interlude. I had a son that was not well for 2 years. He had a bone marrow transplant. I saw him this week in Australia. He is now married. Baruch Hashem, doing very well. He's doing well, but thank God, we spent 2 years in a hospital. His bone marrow donor came to his wedding and was the witness at the chuppah 6 months ago. He's a yeshiva student in Israel, whose cousin is married to my son-in-law in San Francisco's cousin, but there's another story itself. I felt that there was two groups of people who didn't really understand Chabad. The historians within the Orthodox world who had a very parochial view, the art scroll kind of world, and the historians in the broader Jewish community who didn't really understand the impact we were having in the American Jewish community. So initially I came to this as I wanted to set the historical record straight. As time went on, and this was a long process for me, writing a book, and Sue can for sure say this, is a very arduous thing to do. It pulls your kishkas and your guts out. And I had, then you have your ups and downs. First you want to write a book, then you start. Then you don't have a publisher, then you get an agent, then you think you have a publisher. It's a roller coaster. And then you get depressed, and you stop writing the book. And then you figure it's never going to get published, and then somebody tells you to self-publish on Amazon, and who wants to do that? So what happened was, by the time I got to the end of the process, I went through a process of self-examination. And I had to begin to think in a very serious way about what's motivating me, what makes me tick. And what I tried to attempt to do was to pull as much as I could the inner guts of Chabad and bring it to the outside. And I think I had a certain, and because I was coming as an insider, I think there was a lot of people on the inside, especially the leadership of Chabad, who would bring their barriers down when they were speaking to me, because they felt that I would do them right. Even though one guy said to me today, "You wrote the story, it wasn't exactly the way it happened." In the last couple of days, I had one guy in Australia, one guy in New York telling me I made a mistake, which is very good, because now I'll sell more books with the controversy. That's what we're hoping for, you know what I mean? I actually am looking for somebody to excommunicate me or something like that, then I'd sell a lot of books. Yeah. It can be erased. San Francisco, maybe it'll be done.
So,
crashing off the...
Oh, please, I don't want to fall off.
I won't fall off either. You called your book very audaciously, The Secret of Chabad, right? What's the secret?
I think it's a lot of secrets, but I think at the end of the day, what Chabad is about, and you have to ask yourself an interesting question. When Sue wrote her book, she was writing her book a little bit after the Rebbe passed away, and we were just trying to figure out who we were. Now it's 20 years later. So the question is, how does a movement survive 20 years later? And not only that, when you look at Chabad, on the day that the Rebbe passed away, a little over 20 years ago, there was 1,000, these are the exact statistics, and 32 Chabad couples, shluchim, in the world. Today the number is 4,300. So we have quadrupled. And not only that, on a qualitative level, there was many Chabad houses which were little storefronts, and now they're big buildings. Come to Yorba Linda, where I am. We had a little rundown farmhouse with mice that had bubbas and zetas and grandparents and grandchildren. They were multi-generational mice, you know. And now we have a beautiful center. People pull up the building and they want to know if I'm a Reform or Conservative temple, and they're surprised they hear it's Chabad. So things have changed in a lot. So the question is, what's driving this? And I think at the very core of it are that the Rebbe had a fundamental revolutionary way of looking at the world. And I think that there's very important ideas, because you cannot build a movement on emotionalism. You know, I had a 16-year-old kid, but when he was a kid in high school, and he went one year for the Simchas Torah, which was the most glorious holiday to be in Crown Heights around the Rebbe. And he calls me up and he says, "I saw holiness." And this was the more rebellious kid in the family. He got a business degree, and he's doing very well, thank God. But he was a more modern kid in the family. But he said, "I saw holiness." Why? Because he saw Simchas Torah, and he saw the Rebbe and the dancing and everything, and he saw something really uniquely spiritual. Nowadays, you can't build a movement on emotionalism. It has to be something intellectual. So I think at the very core of it are very central ideas about a Weltschauung, a worldview, about Judaism, about responsibility for Jewish destiny, about leadership, it's a series of crucial ideas which I think they're the things that animate the movement, because because we're talking really is about a fundamental different worldview on a theological level to Judaism.
So getting into that a little bit more deeply, there's the idea among the shluchim that I met of mesirat nefesh, a personal self-sacrifice. And it's very, very different from martyrdom. But the idea that you open your book with a tragic story of the Holtzbergs, the young couple in Mumbai, India, who were murdered by terrorists. And it's, thank God not every Chabad Shaliach runs into terrorism and that level of personal difficulties. But when you think of the first people who've gone to various African countries and the first people into Russia and Ukraine, as the movement grows from storefronts to fancy synagogues, how do you expect to maintain that same level of overarching enthusiasm and willingness to sacrifice everything for the movement? How do you maintain a revolution when the revolution is winning?
And the question is more interesting. When you're on the outside of the Jewish establishment, fighting to get in, so you're a little bit, you're a tumul or you're a strasha. When you become the Jewish establishment, and let's be honest, in certain countries today, in Russia, in Australia, in some degree in South Africa, in many smaller countries, we are the Jewish establishment. Mainstream Judaism today, 85% of the synagogues in Australia today, there's 60 Orthodox synagogues in Melbourne and 2 Reform temples, no conservative. 85% of the rabbis in all these congregations are Chabad rabbis. So we become the mainstream Jewish community there. And in Russia, it's also the same, and other countries also. So it goes back to my original point. For a chassid has to always challenge himself and ask himself, am I living up to this value system that I am? And it's very different. When you're a rabbi of a synagogue, so who you're beholden to? You're beholden to the board of directors, and you got to make sure to do everything right, and otherwise they could say, Sayonara, it's wonderful having you. And I was speaking yesterday to a very friend of mine who was a director of a hospital about one of the local Reform rabbis, who's a very dear friend of mine, and he's retired from a very prominent temple. And he says to me, it's terrible, he still has an office, even though he's Rabbi Emeritus. You just see the salary he's getting, even though he's Emeritus. So I said to him, in the traditional Jewish world, a person can stay for life. He says, but he's a hired hand. That's what he says, and this Reform rabbi is a dear friend of mine, a very fine man. So I said, so what is the difference? A shliach, what we call ourselves is different. I'm not a rabbi of a synagogue. I'm a shliach, I'm an emissary of the Rebbe. So if I'm going to be a true chassid, I'm going to ask myself every single day, am I living up to those values? Now, there are people that can become complacent. There are people that can lay back and, I'm now middle-class Hasidic Judaism living in suburbia. I am now comfortable with who I am. And there is a risk to that. But also there's an internal culture of challenging each other. And one of the interesting things about the Chabad culture is its emotional honesty. Rabbis between rabbis. We're much more blunt with each other and direct with each other. And we sit at a table, what's called a Hasidic Fabreng, in a gathering, and we'll say L'chaim, and one guy will say to the other, you know what, you're a little bit moving off the way. So I think that we have to continuously challenge ourselves are we living up to the ideals of who we're supposed to be. And that's not always going to be easy. And you're right, as we become bigger and larger, we can become corporate, and that's risky.
It is risky. It's interesting. I mean, when I started my book, I started my research in 1999. And have any of you here been to the Federation's GA, the General Assembly of the Federations? So every year the Jewish Federations of America have a national conference. And when I started writing my book 15 years ago, Chabad rabbis were not invited as speakers or to lead workshops at any of these general assemblies. When my book came out in 2003, I think that was the first year that a Chabad rabbi was invited to lead a workshop at the General Assembly of the Jewish Federations movement. So really, it's within the last 15 years to a decade.
This year there was a workshop at the GA, and the workshop was about my book. And what the headline of the workshop was, what can we learn from the movement? And Gil Hoffman, who is a writer for the Jerusalem Post, I'm sure you know, he interviewed the night before Bougie Herzog, the leader of the opposition. And he comes to me the next day, and Gil travels in different speaking circuits, and I know him very well. He's taking my grandchildren here to Giants games in Los Angeles.
I'm so jealous.
He is my Gil's Meshuggah about baseball. Anyway, he comes to me, I'm very angry at you. I said, why are you angry at me, Gil? He says, you had 4 times the crowd in your session that I had with the leader of Israel's opposition. They all wanted to come. And just in 2 weeks from now, I'm having the Jewish Federation is having a conference of all their small city executives in Los Angeles, and they've scheduled a 2-hour session with me and them to talk about how these small communities, El Paso, Texas, and towns in South Carolina, Peoria, Illinois, etc., we didn't ask to go. They asked us to come and to talk to them about how they can work with Chabad. So there's a fundamental shift. It's not as far as it should be, where the federation system that used to look down on us, it depends on the city, to be very honest with you, is beginning to look to us as partners because they realize that we're willing to partner with them if they're willing to partner with us. So there is a Teutonic shift going on in the Jewish world right now. Chabad is finally coming to the table. We need, by the way, the challenge for us is, as we come to that table, it means we have to realize that this is a communal table, and we have to learn how to function there also. It's a two-way street.
Should we be speaking without the microphones? Because yours is, there's a lot of static. There's a lot of feedback coming through on that one.
Is there static here? Is there static?
Maybe you can
try mine.
Okay, so we'll work with you. Okay, you ask the questions, and I'll work on it. I got a loud voice anyway, you know what I mean?
I don't have a loud voice.
So let's try without the mic.
Hold it.
Okay.
Because you're going to be doing most of the talking. I'm doing the questioning.
Uh-huh.
All right. Gosh. See, again, it's interesting how I'm asking the questions and you're answering them, because I'm asking the questions from the point of view of an outsider, and you're talking about, because you're a shaliach of the Rebbe, you're talking about what motivates you and how Chabad works internally, and that's so interesting,
right.
how we're talking with each other. I want to talk a little bit about Chabad in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
First, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about Chabad's history in Russia, because I think a lot of American Jews don't know that. Why don't we start with that?
Yeah, I think if you understand Chabad today, you have to understand Chabad today. You have to understand the Russian experience. And I, as somebody who does not come from a Chabad family, understand that Russian experience because it inspired me greatly. And let me put it in context. First thing, if you look back historically, 100, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, a significant portion of Russian Jewry was connected to Chabad one way or the other. The third Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, it was said of him that he had 600,000 followers. If they were all Chassidim or not, but they looked to him as the great leader of Russian Jewry. When communism came into power after World War II, the only religious element left in Russia running a viable organization, there were individuals that was national, was Chabad, and the previous Rebbe, who passed away in New York in 1950, in 1923 or 1924, he does something which is a seminal event, which I believe is a great moment of history. He basically tells the Russians, the communists, I'm not giving in. He takes 9 Hasidim, and he has them swear an oath to keep Judaism alive to their death. Now, we know who many of these people's children are and grandchildren are, and they ran a Jewish underground in Russia that survived all the way through the period of communism. Now, what happened to people like me? In 1947, I write a chapter in the book called The Great Escape, which is how, after World War II, the Russian government allowed Polish Jews who had run to Russia to go back to Poland. So if you came as a Polish Jew, now you had 3 relatives, 2 cousins, a brother-in-law, and a sister, and 1,000 Hasidim escaped, including the grandparents of my son-in-law in San Francisco, who, Baruch Hashem, he has produced for me 6 very beautiful grandchildren. Rabbi Zarchi, some of you, he writes columns from time to time in Sue's newspaper. I have another son-in-law down in Orange County. His grandparents escaped. Now, what happened? Who were these people? They were the hardcore people who survived Judaism in Russia. They come out, and they become to us the role models of self-sacrifice. And if you don't understand the Russian story, you don't understand the Chabad story in America, because the self-sacrifice of standing up for communism laid the foundation for this next generation. So when I grew up, I'm surrounded by all these Russian Hasidim. Ich habe given in Gulag 20 years. I was 20 years in the Gulag. I was 10 years in the prison system. I was 5 years. I only was in jail for a year. So what happened is that, so to speak, laid the foundation for the self-sacrifice here in the United States. And I always think to myself, if I have difficulty in what I'm doing, and we have a lot of difficulties, what are my difficulties compared to my teacher in Yeshiva, Reb Mendel, who spent almost 10 years in Siberia because he smuggled Jews out of Russia in 1947. And these were our role models. These were our examples of what it means. So there was this connection. So my generation got inspired by that generation. And I think the Russian story is seminal to understanding what Chabad is today. Without that, you don't get it. And now the younger generation is growing up. They're not seeing that same, they're not living or surrounded by that self-sacrifice. But I think we've already set the tone in this country to a large degree. So this group of Chassidim, at least they molded my identity profoundly. So when you speak about a person like Natan Sharansky, who was a great Jewish hero, we were surrounded by 25 Natan Sharanskys every single day.
So I brought up that topic because I loved your book, but the chapter that I learned the most from was the chapter on Chabad in Russia. That was a history that I really didn't know, and it's kind of ironic because I majored in Russian history. So it just goes to show that really was a secret story. So thank you for sharing that in your book. So it's interesting. People are always amazed that Chabad is so big in the former Soviet Union. And for me, that's not surprising because of its history there and because of the way Judaism was suppressed for so long in the former Soviet Union. What's surprising to me is Chabad's success in this country. And you've talked a lot, when I asked you what's the secret to Chabad's success, you talk about the internal strength and the teachings of the Rebbe and how they're internalized by the Shluchim, by the Chabadniks. And for me, I see from the outside that Chabad is an American success story that could only have happened in America at the time that it did after the Second World War, the United States is a profoundly religious country. And as the 1960s and 70s came along, there was a bigger opening to spiritual awareness and opening to religiosity in the Jewish community that did not exist in this country before the 1970s. And I think that helped to open a lot of young American Jewish minds in the 1970s and 80s to a different level of observance and practice than their parents would have been open to. My father, would never be, growing up as a deeply secular Jewish doctor in the 1930s and 40s in New Jersey. His generation was not open to the message the same way as later.
But you understand why? Because his also came from a generation that rejected traditional Judaism.
Yes.
And so they're too religious for me. They're too orthodox. And just as a side part, I want to get to this in a second. Russia has a whole different challenge. Because in Russia, there was so little religion. Most Russian Jews know so little about Judaism. That was a challenge into itself. But we can talk more about Russia if you want later. Here in America, when I started off as a shliach 40 years ago, people looked at me like, if the guy fell out of, if I was a rich man, I never was a rich man, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, this is quaint, they're cute, we'll bring them to speak to our local temple, to the youth group, because we want to show them an anachronism of the past. Well, I want to share with you a statistic from a survey that was done by the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, not by us. And the survey, the Federation asked Jews, which they thank God did not make the same mistakes of the Pew study, because the Pew study, that's a different conversation, made some major blunders. And they asked Jews in what they've been active in. And the statistic is that 27% of Jews in Miami have been active in Chabad in the last year. Only 20% of those people say they're Orthodox. But if you go to the figure, the demographic of Jews 35 and younger, the number skyrockets to 47%. 47% say they've been active with Chabad in the last year. Now, what's going on? What's happening? That older generation, they had a grandparent that was too Orthodox, or their parents said their grandparents were too Orthodox. They looked very negatively on religious people. They were also receiving messages, let's say, from certain parts of the Jewish community, which were very, even with all due respect, fiddle in the roof. It's basically a very anti-religious story. Why do we keep tradition? Because it's tradition. In other words, there's no logical, deeper theological reason for Judaism. It's a put-down of traditional Judaism in a very subjective kind of way. So people had all these kinds. Now their kids are growing up. They're going up. They go to they live in some town like Contra Costa, and they go to Camp Gun Israel for the summer. Maybe they go for 2 weeks, and they see a guy who looks like me, with a blacker beard, and he's his counselor. Now they get a little older, and they go off to the University of Texas, or they go to Berkeley, or they go here and they go there, and everybody knows, where's the action? Friday night at Chabad. Who's the rabbi they get to know? The local Chabad rabbi, and the Chabad Rebbetzin. And they see, we, by the way, are the only egalitarian Jewish organization. Because the rabbis and Rebbetzins, jokes aside, are treated equally. In fact, we have 2 conventions every year. One for all the rabbis, and another one for the Rebbetzins. And the Rebbetzins run their own convention with a couple thousand women coming. And last year they had they called it Women Standing Forward. So they see the women, they see the kids, they see the families, which is really interesting role modeling about Jewish families. And now they've become open to tradition. And I believe that we're seeing now a beginning of a revolution in American Jewish life, of a realignment of American Jews to 3 new blocks. On one end will be the Orthodox observant. On the other end, the Reform and Conservative movements are getting closer and closer. They're not going to merge because they got a lot of buildings and infrastructures and endowments. But between me and you, they're getting closer ideologically, philosophically, politically. And in the middle, the new Jewish middle is you guys who go to the JLI classes, and you go to Chabad part-time, and you may go to your local temple part-time. And this is the new middle. You want to be more connected to tradition. You're not willing to you start walking to shul every Shabbos, but you like the cholent. And it's really the cholent. And you want to be connected. And the new middle of American Jewish life, that traditional middle, being nudged toward tradition, is going to emerge as a whole new dynamic.
So that tripartite future of American Judaism that you laid out in the book, I found very interesting and somewhat disturbing. And let me tell you why. I also believe that the Reform and Conservative movement are merging and should merge. And frankly, most of their buildings they're selling already because they don't have enough money to keep them going. And it really comes down to Talach Sinai or not, and they're going to figure that out between the movements. And then there's the Torah, believing that the Torah was given in Sinai to the Jewish people, which the conservative movement takes as a matter of faith, and the Reform movement takes as a matter of if you want to believe it or not. So that is a fundamental theological difference between Reform and conservative Judaism. So I see the liberal Judaism on one side, and I see Orthodox observance Judaism on the other side. Now, when you say, and you posit that American Jews who come to Chabad activities as a third, that is a very interesting scenario, because is that not a limbo situation? Is that a real, and I want you to answer this, is that not a kind of transition to something else? Or is it becoming its own movement, its own denomination? How can it be?
Well, the difference is like this. When they're coming to Chabad, the train is headed toward tradition. And when they're in liberal congregations, with all due respect, and I don't mean disparaging, because I happen to think there's many wonderful people in the liberal movements, and I've learned that there's many people who care deeply about Judaism in the liberal movements, but in general the focus is becoming more so to some degree away from tradition. So what's happening?
We'll argue about that.
Okay, but there is a certain move away from tradition. So, and there, you can argue certain points about this. Reform is getting more traditional, conservative a little less, but what's happening when you go to the Chabad rabbi, you want him to do your wedding, he says, I'm not going to do the wedding unless it's kosher. And the girl's got to go to the mikveh, and we got to do a bunch of things, which he's going to make demands which are done. The kid's going to go to school in a Chabad camp, he's going to sing a song about God gave the Torah Mount Sinai. There's a little bit, there's a push in a different direction. So what I think is Chabad is creating this kind of open, comfortable space, and really what I think is happening here is something much different. American Jewry is going to look like the rest of world Jewry. Why? Because in most countries today in the world, the Jewry that's dominant is Orthodox, but they're not necessarily fully observant. If you go to Australia, you go to South Africa, you go to England, you go to Russia, you go to Israel, you go to most countries outside the United States, the dominant movement is Orthodox, even though the people are not fully observant. And I think that, I don't think Chabad is going to become the dominant because there's other major forces here, but there's going to be a piece of that pie. We have 920 or 930 Chabad centers in the United States. Some of them are the storefront embryonic operations, some of the big buildings with parking lots like mine. A lot of them are between. But as this situation evolves, and Chabad is going to take a larger role, we're going to see this. I do not believe the two movements will merge, because I think you're going to see individual synagogues merging, but the movements themselves are not going to merge, because I think that there's too much invested in the infrastructure, and the differences with them, there is strong differences.
We don't know.
But at the end of the day, they're coming closer together on many issues. But I think that this new middle is going to be a Jew who's connected to tradition, who the Chabad rabbis is fetching the guy along and saying, come Sunday morning and you put on tefillin. Now, he may not put on tefillin every day, and he may not put on tefillin for a few weeks afterwards, but he's being nudged in a certain kind of direction. And the balancing act for us is, if we don't prod, then we're not doing our job. If we prod too much, it might not work either. So it's a delicate balancing act that we have to do also. To encourage people, but not to push them too hard, to encourage them to develop their own Judaism through learning, etc., on their own level. So we're going to have a whole new role here in the Jewish community. And it's going to be, but I think it's more reflective. I just was in Australia yesterday. I came back yesterday morning. Yeah, don't worry, it's fine. I'm good. It's good. I'm happy. I took the plane. I went to sleep. It was fine. Everything's good. I have two beautiful grandchildren in Australia. I have 2 kids that married Australian kids. And what you see in Australia is a tremendous amount of Jews who are not necessarily fully observant, but more connected to tradition. And that's what I think Chabad will accomplish in this country.
So I talked about some of the historic and sociological factors in America in the 1960s and 70s that I think contributed to Chabad's success. And one of them that I didn't mention yet was the growing willingness of Americans to publicly display their ethnic identity that happened in the early 1970s, right? We're no longer a melting pot where everybody wanted to be American. Starting in the 1970s, we want to be a hyphenated American. And that really, I think that Chabad both pushed that along and was able to ride that wave. So I'd love to talk with you about Chabad and public displays of Judaism and how that was important to the Rebbe.
San Francisco is where it started, just so you should know. No, Philadelphia was a big menorah, but it was very tiny. The first public menorah laid ever was a small little menorah in Independence Hall. The first public conflict over a menorah, this is such an interesting story, was here 40 years ago this year, in 1974, in San Francisco, when Rabbi Dovid Eliezrie, who was then the shliach there, decided, and Rabbi Langer, who was still here, was helping him out, decided to put up this big Hanukkah menorah. And the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, Joseph Asher, who was a German Holocaust survivor, and he came from an Orthodox family, and he was an interesting man. He said, "We can't have this. It's too public. It's too Jewish. It's too this. We got to stop it." And what happens is he stops. The federation comes down. There's poor young Chabad rabbis in town. He doesn't want to alienate the community, so he says, "Okay, I'll move it to Stonestown Shopping Center." Well, 4 people come the next year to Stonestown, and they move it back to Union Square. Now, what's happened this year? Temple Emmanuel sponsored public Hanukkah menorah lightings in shopping malls in Marin. I spoke to the rabbi. What's his name? A very fine man.
There's 2 of them. There's a co-rabbi.
Husband and wife.
Singers, Jonathan and Betty.
I spoke to Rabbi Jonathan Singer on the phone because I wrote a piece for the Jewish Journal in L.A. about how now, 40 years later, Temple Emmanuel sponsoring Hanukkah menorahs in public places. I thought this was fantastic. We love the competition. It's great.
I'm so upset with you now that you didn't send that essay to Jay.
But what was the real point? The battle in the Hanukkah menorah, in my opinion, was about 2 things. It was not about church and state. It was about 2 things. What Sue said is so true. Should Judaism be public or private? Because at the time there was a 11th commandment in America called "Thou shalt melt." Be part of the American Jewish experience. Yeah, melt into American Judaism. And here we came along and said nothing. The second part of this battle was, there's an expression in Yiddish, "Wer bist du?" Who are you to light a menorah in the public square? We run the Jewish community. We tell you what to do. How could you possibly do anything? And Chabad was saying to the liberal Jewish establishment at the time, "You can't tell us what to do." And they thought we would bend, and we didn't bend. And so what happened was this menorah, and I wrote a chapter in the book called The Menorah Wars, was really about a battle over about the perception of Jewish identity in America. And I'll tell you so interestingly enough, in the 50s, the Chabad yeshiva, the main yeshiva where they studied, was on Eastern Parkway, and the dorm was on the corner of Bedford and Dean, which is a 15-minute walk. And so at that time, the neighborhood Eastern Parkway, Brooklyn, Crown Heights, which today is a Chabad neighborhood primarily, and now yuppies are beginning to move in, was one of the premier Jewish neighborhoods in New York. The largest synagogue there was the Brooklyn Jewish Center, which was the largest conservative congregation in the United States. So the Rebbe wanted the students to walk home to the dorm every day, down the street, so people would look out of those apartment buildings and would say, "Look at that yeshiva student." He was making a statement about public Jewish identity. And so we wanted to change the world. Now, there's other factors. I think that we had a lot to do with changing the way Jews perceive themselves in America. And I personally feel that America is the greatest blessing for Jews. This is a wonderful country to live in. We can do whatever we want. We have a man that was before the chief of staff of the White House, and now he's the Secretary of Treasury. And that guy is an Orthodox Jew. He davens in a shul every Shabbos. And Attorney General of the United States, McCasey, was an Orthodox Jew. And an Orthodox Jew almost became Vice President of the United States if it wasn't for the hanging chads. And nobody cared about the fact that these people are religious Jews. You either like Jack Lew because of his policies, or you don't like Jack Lew. You liked McCasey, who underneath Bush was the Attorney General, or you didn't like him. You liked Lieberman, or you didn't like him. America is a blessing to us as Jews to live as we choose. I think that we are living in the greatest country that's given more freedoms to Jews than ever before, except for maybe the state of Israel. But for Jews, we live in a blessed environment, and it allows us to be free with our identity, and to be proud of who we are, and to be full, active members of American society, which I think is very important for us.
It's easier to be a liberal Jew in this country than in Israel, which is a sad tragedy.
A longer conversation.
A longer conversation.
We can have another night soon.
Well, we'll have another night. One thing that impressed me when I was doing my research and visiting Chabad couples, Chabad shluchim all over the United States, I would stay in their homes. It's interesting. People would say to me, "Wasn't it hard for you being a woman to get entree to the Chabad world because, they're so male dominant?" I said, "No, because I'm a woman, Davka, I could come and sleep in their house and be with their children and really, get to know the family." And what about the children, right? I mean, a couple, a man and a woman, a rabbi and the Rebbetzin, they choose to be shaliach to the rabbi. They choose to move to Dnipropetrovsk, and they choose to move to Johannesburg, and they choose to move to Alaska or, God forbid, Walnut Creek. They choose to live in these places. But what about their children who are growing up in, they may not have any other friends whose houses they can eat at, all these kinds of things. Talk a little bit about the children, what that means.
It's the hardest part about being a shliach. It's the most difficult of all. And when you don't have friends that socially your friends, it's okay. You can live without it. You have your wife. And we find that couples of shluchim are very connected because they're almost the only two people living that kind of value system. And then what happens is the other trend, somebody gets very religious. And of course, in a place like Walnut Creek, he gets so religious, he says, I want kosher pizza delivered every day. And he moves to Pico Robertson in Los Angeles. When you are bringing up children as Chabad children, I brought up my children in Yorba Linda, California, where there was no other religious children. Occasionally there were a few, and they moved on. And now we're bringing up my grandchildren in Yorba Linda, California. My children, my grandchildren here in San Francisco, in San Francisco. And I have 6 married children, thank God. Baruch Hashem, we finished. We married them all off. And now after 35 years, the house is empty, and me and my wife are talking every day. We haven't talked for 35 years. Now we talk all the time. There's nobody else to talk to. And 3 of our children are shluchim, and 3 of our children are in business. And we hope that will continue, that the businessmen should support the shluchim. This is very important, I told my son-in-law in Australia is launching a business now, you better make a lot of money because you got to support your wife's siblings. But the hardest thing of all is when these children don't have peers. Now, and they don't have friends. So where I lived in Orange County, we had a day school. We sent our kids to school, so that placated a lot. It made it a little bit easier. But my children didn't have too many siblings that were peers that were their age. Now in Orange County, we have a whole generation of younger Chabad rabbis. So my grandchildren have more. What's his name? They have more. They have more. What's his name? They have more kids to play with. But it's the hardest part of the whole thing. And I'll tell you in particular what's more difficult, where we don't have day schools and children have to go to online school. So what parents have to do, in my opinion, is you have to overcompensate, like in many ways. Like many times my children had nobody to play with on a Sunday afternoon, so I would always take them to a park. Or I would take my children when they were growing up to national parks and do trips with them. But I want to tell you a very interesting statistic. It's a very interesting thing. There's a term in the Orthodox world called OTD. Anybody heard this term? Off the derech. People who become less religious. Now, according to statistics in the modern Orthodox world, the OU magazine published, the Jewish Action published, that they say the OTD rate may be close to 25% who are not Shabbos observant. I did an analysis of every Chabad family in California who are shluchim, and I found out that only less than 1% of the children are not fully observant, which is the lowest statistics in the Orthodox world. It's lower than any other segment of the Orthodox world. There was an article in the Jewish Week today. It said 7 to 8% of the families in Satmar, which is a very strong Hasidic group, much more to the right than Chabad, that they are not observant. They're not Satmar Hasidim any longer. So what's going on over here? Why do we have only a 1% attrition rate? And I think it's a few factors. Number one, I think the children of shluchim are extremely well emotionally balanced. They're brought up in homes, and they learn to deal with the world around them, which is so different than their own. Number two, we as parents invest in our children a tremendous amount because we want them to be brought up according to our principles and ideas. I was speaking to a Jewish educator, and I asked him, why are the children of shluchim so strong, and children even in Crown Heights in the Chabad community are not? He says, because a shliach puts so much into their children, they want to compensate for the fact. For instance, my grandchildren, who live in Orange County, we just had a winter camp for boys and girls, separate camp, but over the winter break for only the children of shluchim. So regular Chabad kids couldn't go to a winter camp, but the children of shluchim who are living more isolated, they could go to a winter camp. What do they get? A whole week of intense education, activity, and a lot of things. So we try, many of us, to compensate for this challenge. But the hardest thing of all is when a child has nobody to play with on a Shabbos afternoon, and you can't go anywhere, and you go a little bit crazy. So it's this was the most painful part of me raising my own children. But I see 3 of my children are raising their children in Shluchim, and the other 3 children, 2 of them live in Australia, which is a beautiful Orthodox community, one of the most beautiful communities in the world, and the other one lives in Pico Robertson in L.A., another wonderful religious community, and thank God they're doing very well. But they didn't want that life of isolation, and I respect their wishes. They want to go into business, and I hope they do well. So we have that. It's a major challenge for us.
So you touched on something else, again, interesting when you said that so few of the children of Chabad Shluchim go off the path, become non-observant. And that has to do with the modeling that their parents do and the life that they're brought up to lead. But also there's something that has to be so satisfying in the way they live for them. And I think that you touched upon it again when you talked about being who you are, authentically Jewishly observant, but living in the modern world. And that is really how Chabad is different from the other Hasidic movements.
I think it's a key point.
It's the key point.
Really
right after World War II, when so much of the Hasidic world was decimated and other Hasidic movements continued their insularity and Chabad turned outward. I want you to talk about that.
This is a very important point. And I think that it goes to the great question in modernity for religious Jewry was the challenge of when you lived in the shtetl in Russia, your grandparents 150 years ago, they couldn't go out of the Pale settlement. They couldn't travel more than 50 miles. They had no opportunities. They had no freedoms. So they were stuck. When you live in a modern Western society, you can go wherever you want. I was yesterday in Australia. Today I'm in California. I was in Orange County this morning. I'm here. You can do whatever we want. We can go wherever we want. So the question is, how does a Jew live in the modern world? And the same thing has to do with the state of Israel. This idea of a secular Zionist state posed a tremendous dilemma for religious Jews, because here was a state being built on secular nationalism instead of traditional Judaism, even though it's changed dramatically since its original visionary leaders. So what happened was, in the Orthodox world, we had 3 responses, which was, in the modern Orthodox world, there was a greater embracing of modern Western society. Everybody wanted every one of their kids to go to college. I'll send my kid to Israel for yeshiva a year, but then he's going to go off to Yale or Harvard, etc., etc. Much of the so-called, we do not like the word ultra-Orthodox. We think that's a degrading term, and we actually want the media to start using a term soon called traditional Orthodox. The more Haredi community said, hold on, guys, they're out to get us. They want to destroy our way of life. They have a different value system. We're going to build a moat. We're going to build a castle with a moat around us, and we're going to go out to that world around us, and we're going to deal with it occasionally, but we're going to come right back to the castle. And here comes what I believe is one of the Rebbe's revolutionary ideas. It was a Judaism not built on insecurity and not built on capitulation, but of self-confidence, of being bold. Because when you internalize ideas in the core of who you are, you're not afraid of the world around you. There was a Reform rabbi, Herbert Wiener, wrote a stunning book called 9.5 Mystics in the late 1960s. And he asked the Rebbe once in a private meeting, he says, people say you tell them always what to do. Maybe they're robots. He says, send them wherever they want to go, wherever you can send them, and they're still going to remain true to who they are. So when you become, if you internalize your values, and this is one of the most revolutionary, then you really can be strong Jewish. So one of the most revolutionary ideas was a different response to modernity. And I'll tell you where we saw this interestingly 2 years ago. I was working on the book 2 years ago. I was in Israel, and there was a big debate going on at that time about drafting yeshiva students to the army. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court had made a ruling, and et cetera, et cetera. I want to go into the Supreme Court right now. And so much of the Haredi world said, the more traditionally Orthodox world said, we don't want anything to do with the government. We're not even come to vote. The more religious Zionist world said, well, we want our boys to go to the army. Chabad said, well, we're in the middle. So we sat down and we had an agreement with the army for the last couple of years where our boys could study. The girls are not going to the army, and I don't believe the girls should go to the army, but leave that alone. The boys could go study for up to in yeshiva for 5 or 6 years. They can go to New York for a year or two if they want. And when they come back and they finish their studies, sometimes many of them get married, then they'll go to the army, and then they'll go out to the workforce. So we were the only more traditional Orthodox segment of the community that made a deal with the army. So Bibi Netanyahu decides he's going to go visit Kfar Chabad, the Chabad down in Tel Aviv, because he was getting hit over the head heavy. He wants to bake matzahs. Now listen, Bibi didn't need the matzahs. They could have delivered him the matzahs. But he came there because he wanted to make a statement. I got some religious people that are still my friends. So the Haredi press in Israel went bananas on Chabad. He's destroying our community. He's out to destroy us, and you're welcoming him in. We said, no, we made an arrangement because we believe in what's called principled engagement. Be true to your values, but deal with the world around you. And this is really one of the most radical ideas, because the response to modernity, and even the liberal movements, they're a response to modernity also. So this idea is, and this is where I believe that Chabad's worldview is so fundamentally different than other parts of the Jewish world.
I want to read one paragraph from the book that really touched me and builds upon that point, and then we'd love to open it up to questions for Rabbi Eliezrie. With your permission. Too much going on here. Oy, the glasses. This was This is a paragraph talking about Chabad right after the Rebbe's death in 1994. In the coming days, meaning after his funeral, we returned to our cities and communities in the United States and around the world. The Rebbe's shluchim had set up lifelong posts in some of the world's most unlikely places, Kathmandu, Bahia Blanca, Playa del Carmen, and even the suburbs of American cities, in order to reach Jews and transform modern Jewish life. But the Rebbe believed in doing the hard work of Judaism, finding Jews who have become estranged from their Jewish heritage and helping them rediscover Judaism one small step at a time. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't well-paid work. It wasn't work, frankly, that other parts of the Jewish community wanted to do. But the Rebbe made it clear that this was the most important work we could do in our lives. If a boat has one hole on it, everyone on board is affected. Have some questions? Sir.
I'm from former Soviet Union. And I lived in this country almost 24 years. I will show you picture Lubavitcher Rebbe, which shulchan give in Rostov-on-Don one of my sons, and it's some notes here. But my question about, I didn't read your book. My son promised me to read your book. Can you tell me about secret communication between Ben Lazar and Putin? I received Jewish magazine,
Okay,
and
so
the front was...
So let me talk to you about...
No, I want to finish.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Because possible Jewish value, it's very important. And most people know about what means President Putin, and why Chabad doing this, that he is the best friend for Jewish, and less Jewish left in Russia, you know about this possible better than I.
So let me speak about Putin for a moment. There was a professor of mathematics I met in Novosibirsk. Anybody know where Novosibirsk is? It's in Siberia. I went there for the weekend. The best kosher meal I've ever had on an airplane was in business class between Moscow and Novosibirsk. I'm telling you, it's the best. It's better than the meals you get in business class on United between Newark and Tel Aviv. Really, it's unbelievable. Novosibirsk. Anyway, so this professor tells me, you have to know people who know people. This professor tells me, Putin may not be good for Russia, but he's good for the Jews of Russia. Putin is a true friend of the Jewish community. He is a true friend of the Jewish people. And he has done unbelievable things to help Jews in Russia, 99% nobody knows about. When the Soviet Union was falling apart, he was the vice mayor of Leningrad. At that point, he's what they call in Yiddish a gornisht. He was nothing special. It was, I think, 1992 around. What happened was a group from Israel called Migdal Or, which was a religious group, does a lot of good work around the world. They wanted to open up the first official Jewish school in St. Petersburg. They went to the mayor, who was Jewish, and they asked him to give an authorization. He says, I can't do it because I'm Jewish. So Putin was the vice mayor. He says, I'm going to sign it, I'm going to authorize the school, and I'm going to open it. Nobody even knows he did this. I can tell you another 50 stories like this. Synagogues that were opened, Jewish community. I'll give you, I know the rabbi in Sochi. Sochi is a city, we all know Sochi from the Olympics. So about 10 years ago, he comes to see me in my house in California. He's good friends with my son-in-law, who works with me in Yorba Linda, and he tells me the story. He needed a piece of land for a synagogue in Sochi, and in Russia, mayors are very powerful politically. And the mayor wouldn't give any property. So he's trying to get some piece of property, and it doesn't work. So he calls up Rabbi Dovid Eliezrie, the chief rabbi of Russia, and he knows about a week or two later, an executive jet flies from Moscow to Sochi, and on the executive jet is the equal in the United States of the chief of staff of the White House, Jack Lew, Karl Rove, somebody in that level. He's on Sochi on the ground for 1 hour, and the guy basically tells the mayor, Putin wants the shul built, you better give him a piece of land. And he gets back